The candles had been lit an hour before anyone sat down, and by the time the family assembled in the dining room at Vane Park, the light had settled into its full evening richness, gilding the crystal and the silver and the surface of the long mahogany table until the whole room glowed like something preserved in amber. 12 places had been laid. 12 chairs had been drawn back and set. And 12 people turned, in the same moment, to look at the ring on Miss Cecily Hartwell's hand. She had not hidden it. She had not tried to. She wore it on her right hand as she always wore it, the sapphire catching the candlelight with that particular depth of color, blue-violet as a winter sky at dusk, and she had walked to her seat at the foot of the table as she always did, quietly, with her chin level. 20. Because she had learned in 8 months at Vane Park that the only posture that cost nothing was the one that asked for nothing. She did not look at the ring. She did not look at Lady Maud, who stood at the head of the table with her black silk making not a sound, and her jet mourning brooch at her throat catching no light at all, deliberate in its refusal. She did not look at Mr. Sebia. Gerald Vane, who had paused in the act of pulling out his chair with the expression of a man locating a problem he had expected and is mildly pleased to find arrived on schedule. She looked at the arrangement of hothouse flowers in the center of the table, white chrysanthemums in a silver vase, and she thought of Honoria, and she did not look away. At the far end of the room, Lord Edmund Vane, Earl of Westholt, stood with his back to the fireplace, and his dark gray eyes on her hand. He had arrived from Yorkshire that afternoon. He had changed from his traveling clothes and come down to dinner, because his mother had told him Miss Portia Cavendish was expected, and he understood what that meant, and because the alternative was to remain upstairs alone with the particular quality of silence that Vane Park had developed in the 8 months since his sister died. He had not expected the ring. He had not known the ring had left the house. No one had told him. And looking at it now, small in gold and unquestionably familiar on the governess's hand, he felt something move in his chest that was not precisely anger, and was not precisely grief, and was something older and more difficult than either. He said nothing. He crossed to his chair and sat down. The soup was brought in. No one spoke of the ring. Everyone was thinking of it. Cecily could feel the thinking the way one feels weather coming, a particular pressure against the skin, a quality of attention in the room that had not been there at the previous dinner, or the one before that. She lifted her spoon. She set it down. She lifted it again and she ate, and she did not look at anyone, because she had made her decision before she came downstairs, and she intended to hold to it for exactly as long as the evening required. The ring had been Honoria's since she was 16 years old, a gift from their grandmother on the occasion of her debut. Cecily knew the story because Honoria had told it to her, in the small sitting room off the nursery, where they had spent the autumn evenings when the rest of the house had retired. Honoria curled in the window seat, with her feet tucked under her, and her voice low and quick and particular in the way of someone who finds genuine pleasure in the telling of things. The grandmother had pressed it into her hand the night before the ball, and said only that it had been worn by women who knew their own minds, and that she expected Honoria to be one of them. Honoria had laughed. She had a laugh, like a door opening into a room full of light. She had been dead 8 months and 4 days. Cecily had come to Vane Park in the early spring of that year, as a companion to Honoria, and as governess to young Miss Agnes Vane, the niece whom Honoria managed with what she called benevolent siege. The position had been arranged through a family friend of the Hartwells, who had been dead 2 years by then, and the terms were modest, and Cecily had accepted them, because the alternative was her aunt's spare room in Bath, and her aunt's particular view of what a young woman in reduced circumstances ought to expect from the world, which was very little, and offered quietly, but constantly. Like a dripping tap. She had packed her 2 good gowns and her father's books, and come to Vane Park in the rain, and Honoria had met her at the foot of the stairs, with an expression that suggested she had been waiting rather longer than the carriage's arrival, and was not inclined to be formal about it. They had been friends inside a fortnight. Real friends, the kind that form quickly between women who have been lonely long enough that they recognize the shape of it in each other, without needing to describe it. Honoria spoke to her about books, and about her brother, and about the particular loneliness of being the unmarried sister in a household that had already allocated its attention elsewhere. She spoke about Edmund with a complex, specific fondness, the way you speak about someone you love, and have also on occasion wanted to shake firmly by the shoulders. He was in Yorkshire, she said, because the tenant leases had become a disaster, and he was the only one who would address it properly, rather than paying a steward to address it, and then spending the year arguing with the results. He was like that, she said. He could not leave a thing undone if he could see the undone clearly. Cecily spoke in her more measured way about her father, about the years of managing a house on too little and minding it too much, about the strange, dignified terror of being educated above one's income. She spoke about the books they had kept when they had sold everything else, the deliberate selection, the small library of things her father had said they would never part with, and how she had carried 2 of them to Vane Park in her trunk because she could not bring herself to leave them in Bath at her aunt's mercy. Honoria had asked to see them the following morning, and had spent an hour with each one, asking questions with the same quality of genuine interest she brought to everything, as if the world's supply of interesting things had not yet run low, and she was in no danger of running out of attention for them. They were companionable in the evenings, and pleasant to each other in the mornings, and careful in the ways that mattered about the difference in their stations, without ever allowing it to become the entire truth of what they were to each other. And then, in October, Honoria had fallen ill. It had been swift. The physician had come and gone twice before anyone at Vane Park fully understood what was happening. And by the 3rd visit, there was very little to say that any of them wanted to hear. Cecily had sat with her. She had read to her in the afternoons when reading was possible, and sat with her hands folded in the evenings when it was not, and Agnes had been brought in each morning for 20 minutes, and then taken gently away. Lady Maud had come and gone and come again, stiff and pale, and managing the grief the way she managed all things by not quite looking at it directly. No one had sent for Edmund. Honoria had said, specifically, that no one was to send for Edmund, because he was in Yorkshire, managing the tenant crisis, and she was going to be well, and she would not have him make the journey for a fever. She had not been well. And in the last days, when the quality of the light in the room had changed in the particular way that light changes in a room that is preparing to be vacated, Honoria had taken Cecily's hand and put the ring into it, sapphire and gold and worn smooth at the setting, and said that she wanted her to have it, and that she was not to let Lady Maud put it back in the jewelry case upstairs, because it was not Lady Maud's to put anywhere, and that she was to wear it and think of the grandmother's instruction, and know her own mind. Cecily had said she would. She kept her promises. The ring had been on her hand since the morning after, and she intended it to stay there. What she had not counted on was his coming home. He had arrived in the afternoon, his traveling coat still damp at the shoulders, his carriage pulling into the drive while Cecily was walking Agnes through the rose garden in the grey November light. She had seen him dismount from a distance, had noticed the way he moved, purposeful and slightly too contained. The walk of a man who has been sitting still for many hours, and is making the adjustment between stillness and motion, with great deliberateness. Agnes had said Uncle Edmund, in a voice that had nothing of the governess's careful neutrality, and had taken 3 steps toward the house before Cecily caught her hand. They had been introduced in the entrance hall. He had looked at her, steady and brief, the way he looked at the accounts ledger on the sideboard, in the manner of someone cataloguing. His eyes were dark gray, deeply set, with a vertical scar cutting through the left brow that she had not known to expect, and that made his face, which was already not a face designed for reassurance, somewhat more austere. He had said Miss Hartwell, and she had said my lord, and then Lady Maud had appeared, and the introduction was over, and Cecily had taken Agnes upstairs for her afternoon lesson, and had not thought again about the Earl of Westholt until dinner-time, when she had put on her white gown and the blue sash and the cream shawl, and had looked at the ring on her hand and understood for the first time that tonight was going to be something other than the usual dinner. Lady Maud had come to her room at 5:30. She had stood in the doorway in her black silk and looked at the ring with the expression, she reserved for things that had been left where they did not belong. "My son is home," she had said. "Yes, my lady," Cecily had said. "Miss Cavendish will be joining us this evening. She is the daughter of Sir Aldous Cavendish of Cheltenham. You will understand the significance, of course," Cecily had said. Lady Maud had looked at the ring once more, and then at Cecily's face, and whatever she had intended to say next had stayed unsaid, because something in Cecily's steadiness had made the conversation costly in a way she had not budgeted for. She had turned and gone, and Cecily had heard her skirts on the corridor floorboards until the sound disappeared. If you have stayed with this story, you know already what kind of woman is needed in a house like Vane Park, and what kind it tends to produce. Stay a little longer. She had gone to dinner. She had sat in her chair, and the ring had done what rings do, which is to say nothing, and to mean everything, and to hold its color in the light with complete indifference to what anyone in the room thought about it. The soup was taken away. The fish course arrived. Gerald, who sat to Lady Maud's left, and had the particular quality of alertness that belongs to men who believe themselves useful, leaned toward his cousin's mother and said something close to her ear that Cecily could not hear but could understand from the small performance of deliberate not-looking that it required. Lady Maud's response was a single controlled glance at the ring, and then away, and the conversation at the table surface continued about the hunting season and the condition of the roads from London and whether the winter was likely to be a severe one. Portia Cavendish sat 3 places to Cecily's right, and was everything Lady Maud had implied. She was fair and pleasant and genuinely well-dressed, with cornflower eyes and the easy confidence of a young woman who has never had occasion to doubt her welcome in a room. She spoke with intelligence and good humor, and she asked Edmund questions about the northern estates, with what seemed to be real interest. Edmund answered her with the same measured civility he brought to every exchange, and Cecily watched him across the table and thought that he looked like a man performing politeness from a very great distance, as if the part of him that would have been genuinely present had been left somewhere else entirely, and he had sent this composed, precise facsimile to manage the evening in its absence. He had not looked at her again. He had not looked at the ring. He was looking very deliberately at everything else in the room. And Cecily, who had learned in 24 years to read the cost of deliberateness, understood that this was not absence. This was effort. The fish was taken away. The meat arrived. Agnes was in the nursery upstairs with Mrs. Hobbs, the housekeeper, as she was every evening, and Cecily thought of her suddenly and sharply, the way you think of a warm room when you are standing in the cold. What she did not know, could not have known from where she sat, was that he had seen her with Agnes 2 weeks before he came home. He had sent Mr. Brew, Prentice, the family solicitor, ahead to review the estate documents, and Prentice had stayed at Vane Park 4 days before Edmund's own arrival, and on his second day there he had mentioned, in a letter to Edmund, that the governess and the ward were a credit to the household, and that Miss Agnes in particular seemed well settled for a child who had lost her aunt so recently. It was a solicitor's observation offhand, and practical. Edmund had read it and set it aside. He had arrived a week earlier than planned, and on the afternoon of the day before he came down the drive, he had passed through the east corridor on his way to the library, and had heard a voice reading aloud from behind the sitting-room door. A woman's voice, low and precise, and with a quality of attention in it that made him slow his steps without intending to. He had listened for a moment through the door. The voice was reading from a novel, and then it had paused, and Agnes had said something in her quick, direct way, and the voice had answered her, not about the book, but about Honoria. About the way Honoria had read the same passage 2 years ago, and had stopped at the same word and said that she thought the author had put it there on purpose, and that she had a theory about it, and that she would tell Agnes when Agnes was a little older and could appreciate the full difficulty of the theory. And the voice had said all of this with a particular quality of careful love, the way you handle something that can break and will not be replaced, and he had stood in the corridor outside the door for a long time, longer than he intended, with his hand flat against the paneled wall and his eyes closed and his throat working. He had not known before that moment that anyone in this house had been keeping Honoria alive for Agnes in that specific way, in the small particulars of her, the way she laughed, the theories she kept for later, the books she left half-finished. He had been in Yorkshire. He had read the letter that arrived too late and had ridden south in the dark and had arrived to a house already arranged for absence. The rooms closed, the chair moved, the small evidence of a person quietly redistributed until only the formal grief remained. He had not known that in the sitting room, off the nursery, a woman with an ink stain on her right forefinger had been keeping the informal grief alive, the living kind that remembers the sound of a laugh rather than the shape of a tomb. He had stood there for a long time. He had not gone in. He had continued to the library, and stood at the window, overlooking the garden, and looked at the bare trees for a quarter of an hour before he was able to read the accounts. That was what he had been carrying into dinner, and now the meat was on the plates, and the wine had been poured, and Mrs. Fellows, who sat between Gerald and the young baronet from the neighboring estate, leaned across to Mrs. Brack. All this on her right, and said, in the particular kind of not quite whisper that is designed to be heard by a specific person, that she wondered whether someone ought to have advised the governess about appropriate jewelry, because that ring was certainly not what one expected to see on a companion's hand at a family dinner, and it did rather make one wonder. She did not look at Cecily when she said it. She did not need to. Lady Maud set down her wine-glass. What happened next happened in the space of perhaps 30 seconds, but had the quality of a much longer passage of time, the way certain moments do when they have been building for months, and finally arrive at their weight. Lady Maud said, in a voice that was perfectly controlled and perfectly intended to fill the table, "Miss Hartwell, that ring." Cecily looked up. "I wonder if you would be so good as to explain how you came to be wearing it." The table was very quiet. Portia looked at her plate. Gerald did not look at his plate. The baronet from the neighboring estate looked at the flowers. Mrs. Fellows looked at Lady Maud with an expression of concentrated interest. The Earl looked at Cecily. "It was given to me," Cecily said, "by Lady Honoria. Shortly before she died, the quality of the silence changed. Honoria did not give away her jewelry," Lady Maud said. "That ring has been in this family since my mother-in-law's day. It is not the sort of thing one gives away to a governess." There it was. The word landed in the room like a stone, dropped in still water, and the ripples went out from it in every direction, and Cecily felt each one nevertheless. She said, "That is what she did." "What you are describing," Lady Maud said, with the measured precision of a woman who has spent 40 years perfecting the art of saying devastating things in a tone of mild concern, "is a governess helping herself to a dying woman's possessions, and now wearing those possessions at a family table as though she had any right to them. I find that I cannot let the claim pass without comment." The word governess was a stone in still water. The room held its breath. Gerald Vane cleared his throat in the manner of a man lending his weight to a structure he did not build. "Surely this is a matter that ought to have been raised with the family," he said. "At the time, it is hardly appropriate that a governess should take it upon herself to make unilateral decisions about family jewelry." "I raised it," Cecily said, "with Lady Honoria. At the time, Lady Honoria was not in a condition to make lasting decisions about property," Lady Maud said. Her voice had gone a degree cooler, the way a room goes when a window is opened somewhere that you cannot see. "She was ill, Miss Hartwell. The decisions made at the bedside of an ill woman, by a woman employed in this household, and therefore in a position of some influence, cannot be treated as binding. I would have thought you would understand that without it needing to be said." "Lady Honoria understood her own mind," Cecily said. The room flinched, not physically. Something shifted in it, a collective recalibration, the way a group of people recalibrate when someone says a plain true thing in a moment designed for careful untruths. Lady Maud's pale eyes went flat. "And you, Miss Hartwell, ought to have understood your position and acted accordingly. Instead, you have chosen to wear that ring to dinner in this house tonight of all nights. And I can only conclude that the motivation is precisely what it appears to be." The room waited. Portia's fork rested against the edge of her plate and did not move. Mrs. Fellows looked at Lady Maud with the satisfied attention of someone watching a scene she will describe in letters for the next 3 months. Cecily said nothing. She had known, when she put the ring on, that a version of this conversation was possible. She had put it on anyway, because Honoria had asked her to, and because she had said she would, and because there was a particular kind of fear that once you let it govern you, never stops requiring payment. She had not expected it to be this quick, or this public, or quite this cold. She was not surprised by it. She was not going to take the ring off. She was not going to cry. She was going to sit here with her hands folded in her lap and the ring on her finger, and let whatever happened next happen, because she had learned in 24 years that the only thing she controlled was what she did with her own hands and her own mouth. And she intended to control them well. The dark had arrived, and she could feel it settling over the table, and she knew that whatever she said now, into this particular silence, would not be believed, and that Lady Maud knew it too, and that this had been the design of the thing from the beginning. He stood up. It was not dramatic. It was not loud. He simply rose from his chair at the head of the table with the same unhurried economy with which he did everything, and the room looked at him the way rooms look at men who carry that particular quality of authority, which is to say immediately and entirely. "Miss Hartwell," he said. She looked at him. "Honoria left a letter," he said. "With Mr. Prentice he arrived this afternoon. I have not yet read it. I believe you have read yours." "It was not a question," Cecily said, steadily. "Yes. Would you be willing to read it aloud?" The table had gone very still. Lady Maud's hand rested on the tablecloth with the flatness of a hand that has been deliberately placed rather than allowed to settle. Gerald's face had the careful blankness of a man revising his position at speed. "Yes," Cecily said. "I would." She reached into the small pocket sewn into the seam of her gown, the one that she had put there herself, because she had carried the letter everywhere since the morning it arrived from Mr. Roble. Prentice's office 3 weeks ago, and she had not known she was going to need it tonight, but she had known she was going to need it eventually, and she drew it out. The paper had been folded and refolded many times, and the creases were soft. The seal was Honoria's own, a small spray of flowers in red wax, pressed with the ring she had been wearing in the months before she died. Not this ring, a different one. She unfolded it. Her hands did not shake. Honoria had written in her characteristic hand, quick and slightly slanted, with the particular enthusiasm of someone who found writing a pleasure rather than a duty. Cecily read, "My dearest Cecily, if Mr. Prentice is sending you this, then the thing I thought might happen has happened, and I am sorry for it. The ring is yours. It was always yours from the moment I decided to give it you, which was approximately the second week of your arrival when you told Agnes, without flinching, that being lonely was not a failing of character, and was simply something that happened to careful people who had not yet found their particular room in the world. I thought that was the finest thing I had heard anyone say to a child, and I put the ring on my hand that night, and looked at it and thought about who ought to have it. I want you to wear it. I want you not to put it in the jewelry case, because my mother will put it in the jewelry case. And I want my brother to understand when the time is right for him to understand it, that the women who have worn this ring have known their own minds, and that I expect you to be one of them." Cecily stopped. She folded the letter with care. The room did not breathe. He said, into the silence that followed, "My sister chose well." His voice was level and quiet, with the particular quality of a man who has arrived at the end of a long private journey and is saying the last words of it aloud for the first time. "I intend to honor that choice." That was all. 12 words. He said them once and did not repeat them, and did not explain them. He crossed the room, 3 measured strides along the side of the table, and stood beside Cecily's chair and held out his hand. Not in the manner of a man assisting a woman to her feet. In the manner of a man claiming a position beside someone he intends to stand beside, and inviting her to understand the permanence of the standing. Cecily looked at his outstretched hand. Then she looked at his face. The vertical scar through the left brow was very clear in the candlelight, a pale line cutting through dark. His dark gray eyes were steady and serious, and entirely present in a way that they had not been at any other point in the evening, as if the distance he had been keeping all night had finally closed, and what remained was only this room, this table, this hand extended, this choice being made without apology in front of 12 witnesses, with the candles burning and the wine poured and the elaborate careful machinery of the evening's original design dismantled quietly around them. She put her hand in his. Lady Maud did not speak. Whatever she might have said remained in her compressed and unexpressed, because there was nothing to say that the room had not already heard and already settled. She sat very straight in her chair with her pearl bracelet on her wrist and her pale eyes fixed on a point just above the flower arrangement, and the confidence that had filled the room at the start of the evening had gone out of her like a tide going out, steady and complete, and leaving the ground visible. Portia looked at her plate. She was too well bred to show anything useful on her face, but her fork had been set down with the finality of a thing put aside rather than rested. Gerald's particular quality of useful alertness had become something quieter and less certain, and he did not clear his throat again. Mrs. Fellows said nothing more about appropriate jewelry. Mr. Bullibot? Prentice arrived the following morning with the sealed letter Edmund had mentioned, and a document box, and the particular expression of a solicitor who has been anticipating a conclusion for some time, and is not displeased to see it arrive. He and Edmund sat for 2 hours in the study, and Cecily, who was reading with Agnes in the sitting-room down the hall, could hear the low register of their voices through the walls without making out the words, which was as it should be. Agnes pressed her chin against the top of Cecily's arm in the way she had, and said, "Will you stay?" "I believe so," Cecily said. "Good," Agnes said. "I thought you would, because of the ring." Cecily looked at the ring on her hand. The sapphire held the morning light from the window with the same tranquil depth it had held the candlelight the night before. "The ring is just a ring," she said. Agnes considered this for approximately 3 seconds. "No," Agnes said. "It is not." And then she returned to her book with the air of a child who has made an observation she considers self-evident and does not feel the need to elaborate upon. There are moments that arrive at the end of a long and particular kind of patience that do not announce themselves with flourish. They come quietly, the way warmth comes into a room when a fire has been built in the next one and the connecting door is finally opened. Cicely had spent 2 years learning to manage on too little, and 8 months in a house that had not quite decided what to do with her, and 1 autumn of sitting at a woman's bedside watching something irreplaceable leave the world. She had worn the ring every day since, and had not been asked to explain it until last night, and she had explained it as plainly as she was able. And what had happened after had not been of her making or her engineering, only her witnessing. She was good at witnessing. She had learned it early. Edmund found her in the garden in the early afternoon, the November light flat and gray and gentle over the stone walls, and the last of the autumn grass. He came across the lawn with the same purposeful and slightly too contained walk she had noticed when he arrived, and she waited, with her hands folded in the front of her coat, and did not pretend to be looking at something else. He stood beside her. He was close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him against the cold of the November air, the particular solidity of a person who moves through the world with a great deal of weight and has learned to carry it quietly. For a moment they were both looking at the bare trees at the garden's edge, the branches very clear against the pale sky. A blackbird landed on the garden wall and departed again. The sound of Agnes's voice drifted from somewhere inside the house, high and clear and briefly certain of something. He said, "Honoria wrote that she had told you about the ring's history." "She did," Cecily said. "The grandmother," he said. "The debut. Yes. She told me the story differently." There was something in his voice she had not heard before, a texture, underneath the level quiet, something that had been there all along beneath the controlled surface and had not yet found its way out. "She told me the grandmother had said it was for women who stayed when it would have been easier to leave." Cecily was quiet. "She stayed with you," he said, at the end. "She did," Cecily said. "And I with her." He turned his head and looked at her directly, with the full weight of his attention, which was a different thing from the measured cataloging glance of the entrance hall and from the deliberate not-looking of the dinner table. This was something unguarded, the face of a man who has held himself in careful order for a very long time and is allowing, in this particular moment, the careful order to rest. He said, "I did not come home in time." "No," she said. "She would not send for me?" "I know," she said. "She told me." He looked away again toward the trees. "Did she say, why?" "She said that you would have come and that you would have blamed yourself for whatever happened, and that she did not want your last memory of her to be a sick room. She said you were very bad at being helpless, and that she was protecting you from it." He was silent for a moment. A long one. "That sounds like Honoria," he said. "It does," Cecily said. The light shifted faintly. A cloud moved. The garden went a degree warmer for a moment and then returned to its pale equanimity. He said quietly, "I have been very bad at this." He did not specify which part. He did not need to. "You were in Yorkshire," she said. "I mean the month since," he said. "I came home to the wrong things. I was looking at the wrong questions. My mother arranged this dinner and I permitted it, because I did not know what else to do with myself, and that was wrong, and last night was the consequence." Cecily said nothing. "You should not have had to do that alone," he said. "At the dinner table, you should not have had to defend yourself with her letter, when I should have known months ago what the letter contained." "You did not know," she said. "No," he said. "But I should have asked." He paused. "I have been asking myself since last night what Honoria would have thought of me, of the dinner, of what it required of you." "Yeah." Cecily had thought about this herself, in the quiet of her room after the dinner had concluded, and the guests had gone and Agnes had been put to bed. She had thought about what Honoria would have said, specifically, in that particular voice that made everything sound both affectionate and precisely accurate at once. She would have said, Cecily said carefully, that you arrived at the correct answer by the correct method, which is the important thing, and that you were only slightly behind the pace she had hoped for, which was a reasonable outcome, given the circumstances. He was quiet for a moment. Then he made a sound that she did not at first identify, and then did. It was, quietly, the beginning of something like a laugh. It arrived reluctantly, as if it had forgotten the route, and it lasted only a moment, but it was real. She looked at him. The scar through the left brow was very clear in the soft gray light, and his face, which had been composed and contained and entirely too careful since the moment she had met him, had, in this moment, the quality of a room when the windows are finally opened. "Yes," he said. That is exactly what she would have said. He looked at her hand at the ring. "May I ask you something?" he said. "Yes," she said. He did not ask it immediately. He looked at the bare trees, and then back at her, and when he spoke, there was no careful distance in his voice, and no performance of civility, and nothing managed or allocated. There was only the plain question of a man who has arrived at last, at what he actually means. "Will you let me learn what she saw in you?" The garden was very quiet. The November air was cold and still, and the last of the afternoon light lay flat and silver across the gray stone of the estate wall. And somewhere in the house behind them, Agnes was asking Mrs. Hobbs something urgent about supper. Cecily looked at the ring on her hand. She thought of Honoria in the window seat with her feet tucked under her, laughing at something. She thought of the grandmother she had never met, and the instruction, and the women who had worn it before, and the understanding that had been passed between them, like something cupped in two hands against the wind. She looked at him. She said, "Yes, that evening, after Agnes had been put to bed and the fire in the sitting room had settled into its steady low burning, Edmund brought her the letter Prentice had delivered, the one Honoria had addressed to him. He did not say what was in it. He set it on the table beside her chair, and she looked at it, at the familiar slanted handwriting and then at him, and understood that he had already read it, and that showing her was its own kind of answer. She did not open it. She did not need to. She picked up her book and continued reading where she had left off. It was the same novel she had been reading to Agnes that afternoon, the one she had been reading to Agnes before Edmund arrived and stopped in the corridor. She had not told him that. She thought she might. Eventually. There was time for that now. Which was a thought she had not quite permitted herself before tonight. After a moment, Edmund sat in the chair across the fire and opened the estate accounts he had brought from the study, and the room held them, both with the particular warmth of a fire that has been burning long enough to know the dimensions of the space it heats. On the small table between their chairs, beside the candlestick and the folded letter and the unopened book of hymns Agnes had left there that afternoon, the sapphire ring sat in the light and held it quietly, the way certain things hold what they are given without making a point of it. It says, the window was dark, the night outside was November cold. Inside, the fire burned on, and the evening settled around them, and whatever Honoria Vane had intended to set in motion had arrived at last at its proper destination. If her story moved, you leave a word in the comments. She was worth knowing. They both were. She had known her own mind. And now, finally, so did he.